Hello, and welcome back to the Crime Folio. Thank you for joining us as we open another unsettling chapter from the archives of true crime. The open road has long been a symbol of freedom and possibility. An outstretched thumb was an act of trust, a belief in the kindness of strangers. But for some, this gesture led not to a destination, but to a terrifying end. Today, we delve into the story of a killer who exploited this very trust, turning the nation's highways into his hunting ground, a predator who roamed the roads, leaving a trail of fear and mystery in his wake. Case 1. The Co-ed Killer of Santa Cruz, a story of a disturbed giant who targeted female hitchhikers, concealing his rage behind a disarming facade. Our journey into the terror of the open road begins in a place that, on the surface, seemed an emblem of peace and love. Santa Cruz, California, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, was a haven for the counterculture movement. It was a picturesque coastal city, cradled by redwood-forested mountains and the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. It was home to a new university, the University of California, Santa Cruz, whose students embodied the era's spirit of freedom, intellectual curiosity, and a communal trust that felt almost unbreakable. In this idyllic setting, hitchhiking was not just a means of transportation. It was a social contract. An arm extended with an upturned thumb was a symbol of shared humanity, a belief that a fellow traveler would offer a ride, a conversation, and safe passage. It was a thread woven into the very fabric of the community's identity. But this thread of trust was about to be twisted into a garrote, and the idyllic landscape would soon become the backdrop for a series of crimes so methodical and so brutal, they would forever stain the name of this peaceful city. The horror that descended upon Santa Cruz did not come in the form of a shadowy, unrecognizable monster. It came in the form of a man who was, by all accounts, friendly, intelligent, and disarmingly polite. A man who drove the same winding roads as everyone else, listened to the same radio stations, and even drank with the very police officers who were hunting for him. His name was Edmund Emil Kemper III, and he was a giant. By his early 20s, he stood at 6 feet, 9 inches tall, and weighed nearly 300 pounds. But his imposing physical presence was offset by a mild-mannered demeanor and a strikingly high intellect, with a tested IQ of 145. He was articulate, thoughtful, and possessed an almost unnerving ability to make people feel at ease. This was his greatest weapon. This was the mask he had perfected. The mask concealed a chasm of rage, a history of profound disturbance that began long before he ever offered a ride to an unsuspecting student. Born in 1948, Kemper's childhood was a blueprint for violence. His mother, Clarnell, was a domineering and emotionally abusive alcoholic who relentlessly belittled her son, particularly for his size. She would mock him, lock him in the basement, and fill his mind with the poison that he was a freak, an aberration she wished had never been born. This maternal rejection festered, mutating into a deep-seated and generalized hatred of women. The first violent eruption occurred on his grandparents' farm in North Fork, California. In August 1964, at the age of just 15, following an argument with his grandmother, he retrieved a .22 caliber rifle. He shot her dead as she sat at the kitchen table. When his grandfather returned from the grocery store, Kemper met him in the driveway and shot him as well. He then called his mother, who instructed him to call the police. When authorities arrived, the teenage Kemper was calm, coherent, and chillingly matter-of-fact. He explained his actions with a cold logic that stunned the officers. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and committed to the Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane. It was here that Kemper, the budding psychopath, learned his most valuable lesson: how to mimic normalcy. He became a model inmate. His high IQ allowed him to absorb the language of psychiatry, to understand precisely what the doctors wanted to hear. He learned to talk about remorse, rehabilitation, and insight. He administered psychological tests to other inmates, earning the trust of the staff who saw him as a brilliant, misunderstood young man who had made a tragic mistake. He convinced them he was cured. After only 5 years, against the recommendations of some of his own psychiatrists who saw a flicker of the darkness he could not fully conceal, Edmund Kemper was paroled back into the care of the very woman who had forged his rage, his mother. He was 21 years old. He returned to Santa Cruz, living in a small apartment while his mother lived nearby. He desperately wanted to be a police officer, an ambition fueled by a desire for authority and, perhaps, a twisted need to be on the right side of the law he knew he would one day break. He was rejected due to his immense size and his juvenile record. The rejection stung, but he found a way to live vicariously. He frequented a local bar called the Jury Room, a popular hangout for off-duty Santa Cruz police officers. He would buy them drinks, listen to their stories, and absorb the details of their investigative techniques. They knew him as Big Ed, a gentle, slightly goofy giant. They had no idea they were sharing beers with the man who would soon become their most terrifying adversary. He took a job with the California Highway Department, a position that gave him a legitimate reason to be on the roads at all hours. He was equipped with a car, an official-looking vehicle that lent him an air of authority. And in his mind, a plan began to form, a dark culmination of all the hate that his mother had instilled in him. The trusting, hitchhiking coeds of Santa Cruz would become the surrogates for his lifetime of maternal wrath. The terror began on May 7, 1972. Mary and Pesci and Anita Luchessa were both 18-year-old freshmen at Fresno State College, visiting friends at UC Santa Cruz for the weekend. They were bright, vibrant young women with their entire lives ahead of them. When it was time to head back to Fresno, they decided to hitchhike. It was a common, almost casual decision. Standing by the roadside, their thumbs outstretched, they were the embodiment of the era's carefree spirit. A car pulled over. The driver was a large, friendly-looking man who offered them a ride. They saw no reason to fear him. The man was Edmund Kemper. Once they were in his car, the friendly facade dissolved. He drove them not toward the highway, but up into the remote, winding roads of the Santa Cruz Mountains. The omniscient narrative allows us to feel the dawning horror in the car, the shift in the atmosphere from casual conversation to a silent, suffocating dread. Kemper pulled a pistol. He forced one of the girls into the trunk before driving to a secluded, wooded area. There, in the dispassionate silence of the forest, he murdered them both. The violence was swift and brutal. But for Kemper, death was only the beginning. His actions that followed were a desecration born of years of violent fantasy. He took their bodies back to his mother's apartment, where he dismembered them. It was a methodical, almost surgical process. He then packaged the remains and, over time, disposed of them in various remote locations, including a deep ravine off a mountain road. The disappearances of Pesci and Luchessa sent a ripple of unease through the community, but with no bodies and no witnesses, the investigation stalled. They were simply two more young people who had vanished. For 4 months, there was silence. Kemper went about his life. He worked his job, he drank with the cops at the jury room, and he waited. The rage within him was a patient predator. Then, on September 14, 1972, he struck again. Aiko Ku, a 15-year-old dance student, was on her way to a class. She was a dedicated artist, a quiet and focused girl. She made the fatal mistake of accepting a ride from Big Ed. He followed the same pattern. The drive into the mountains, the murder, and the subsequent, horrific rituals at his apartment. Aiko's disappearance added to the growing sense of fear. The local papers began to connect the cases. A pattern was emerging. Young women, hitchhikers, were vanishing without a trace. The term the co-ed killer began to surface, a chilling moniker for a phantom who haunted the roads. The community tried to adapt. Parents warned their daughters. The university issued bulletins. The act of hitchhiking, once a symbol of freedom, became an act of extreme risk. But the habit was deeply ingrained, and for some, it was the only option. On January 8, 1973, Cindy Shaw, an 18-year-old student at Cabrillo College, was hitchhiking home. She was a determined young woman, working her way through school. Kemper saw her, her thumb out, a hopeful expression on her face. He pulled over. He was polite, offering her a ride directly to her door. She got in. The journey ended in the same secluded patch of woods as the others. Her murder was followed by the same grotesque post-mortem mutilation. By now, Kemper's methods were practiced, efficient. He was a craftsman of death. The police were under immense pressure. They had no physical evidence, no reliable witnesses, and a growing list of missing women. They interviewed suspects, followed false leads, and felt the mounting frustration of chasing a ghost. All the while, the ghost was sitting on a bar stool beside them, listening intently as they discussed their own failing investigation. Kemper relished this proximity to the hunt. It was part of the thrill, a testament to his superior intellect and his ability to deceive. He felt invisible, untouchable. His confidence, or perhaps his compulsion, was growing. He was no longer content with killing one at a time. On February 5, 1973, he saw two women hitchhiking together near the UC Santa Cruz campus. Rosalind Thorpe, 23, and Alice Liu, 21. Rosalind was a sharp, witty student known for her strong personality. Alice was quieter, a recent transfer to the university. Seeing two women together might have deterred a lesser predator, but for Kemper, it was merely a logistical challenge. He pulled over, his large car easily accommodating them. He engaged them in conversation, putting them at ease with his articulate and intelligent manner. He likely spoke about the university, about the area, feigning a shared sense of community. But once he had them on a deserted road, the mask dropped for the final time. The murder of Thorpe and Liu was particularly savage. After shooting Thorpe, he was forced to chase down and kill the fleeing Liu, an act that deviated from his preferred method of total control. This deviation seemed to enrage him further. He took both of their bodies back to his apartment. The subsequent desecration was committed with the same cold detachment as before. He disposed of their remains in the same manner as the others, scattering them across the landscape, ensuring they would not be easily found. The disappearances of Thorpe and Liu plunged Santa Cruz into a state of outright panic. The co-ed killer was no longer a phantom. He was a tangible, active threat. The number of hitchhikers on the roads plummeted. The trust that had defined the community was shattered. Women walked in groups, carried weapons, and looked at every passing car with suspicion. The idyllic California dream had become a waking nightmare. Yet, even as he terrorized the region, the core of Kemper's rage remained focused on its original source, his mother, Clarnell. The co-ed murders were, in his own mind, practice. They were a dress rehearsal for the final, defining act of his violent career. His relationship with her had not improved. She continued to mock and berate him, her words a constant, dripping acid on his psyche. He had spent his life fantasizing about killing her, and now, having honed his skills on 6 innocent young women, he felt ready. The final crescendo of his symphony of violence was at hand. On the night of April 20th, 1973, Good Friday, the tension in the apartment he now shared with his mother reached its breaking point. They argued. Her voice, filled with the familiar venomous contempt, was the final trigger. After she went to bed, Kemper entered her room. He waited for her to fall asleep, and then he bludgeoned her to death with a claw hammer. For him, this was the ultimate act of liberation. The source of all his pain and humiliation was finally silenced. To complete his act of symbolic revenge, he then decapitated her and subjected her severed head to unspeakable acts of oral desecration before using it as a dartboard. It was an act of pure, distilled hatred, the culmination of a lifetime of abuse. He wasn't finished. His mother had a close friend, 59-year-old Sarah Sally Hallett, whom he also despised. He knew she was due to arrive for dinner the next day. He cleaned the apartment meticulously. The following day, when Hallett arrived, he invited her inside and, with chilling calm, strangled her to death. He placed her body in a closet. With the two primary objects of his real-world hatred now dead, a strange calm settled over Kemper. His life's work, as he saw it, was complete. He packed a few belongings, took some cash, and fled in his car heading east. He drove for hours, listening to news reports about the ongoing search for the co-ed killer. He was amused and slightly insulted that there were no reports yet about his mother's death. He drove across Nevada and into Utah. He kept driving, listening, waiting to hear his name, waiting for the manhunt to begin. But there was nothing. No one knew he had killed his mother. No one knew he was the co-ed killer. The realization began to dawn on him. He was so good at his gruesome work that he could simply disappear. The thought, however, did not bring relief. It brought a profound and terrifying emptiness. He had built his entire identity around this rage and this secret. Without it, he was nothing. The thrill was gone, replaced by a void. He drove on, reaching Pueblo, Colorado. He was out of money and out of purpose. He found a phone booth on a lonely highway. It was there, on April 24th, 1973, that the giant who had terrorized a community decided to end the story himself. He called the Santa Cruz Police Department. The initial operator was skeptical, but Kemper was persistent, asking to speak to a specific officer he knew from his time at the jury room. When he was finally put through to the homicide division, his confession began. "I have something to tell you," he said, his voice calm and articulate. "I killed my mother and her friend, and I killed those co-eds." The police on the other end of the line were stunned into silence. They knew Big Ed. He was the friendly guy, the gentle giant. It seemed impossible. They thought it was a prank. But as Kemper began to provide details that only the killer could know, such as the locations of the undiscovered remains of his victims, the horrifying truth began to sink in. He gave them the location of his last victim, Alice Liu, whose head he had buried in his mother's garden. He described, with clinical precision, the crimes he had committed against each of his 8 victims. His confession was the key that unlocked the entire nightmare. The Pueblo police were notified, and Edmund Kemper surrendered without a struggle. He seemed almost relieved. Back in California, his trial was a media sensation. He did not feign insanity this time. Instead, he took the stand and became the star witness against himself. He spoke for hours, his high IQ and articulate nature on full display as he dissected his own psyche, his motives, and the gruesome details of his crimes. He told the jury he deserved death by torture. He was found sane and guilty on 8 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences and sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. In prison, Edmund Kemper became an object of fascination for criminologists and the FBI's fledgling behavioral science unit. His detailed, dispassionate interviews provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a certain type of serial killer, the organized, intelligent predator who hides in plain sight. He helped them understand the role of fantasy, the significance of a killer's first murder, and the patterns that could be used to hunt others like him. He became, in a twisted irony, a tool for law enforcement, the very profession he had once aspired to join. The gentle giant, the man who shared drinks with cops, became their most valuable and horrifying textbook. The case of the co-ed killer left an indelible scar on Santa Cruz. The trust that had once been the city's lifeblood was gone, replaced by a lingering fear. The open road was no longer a symbol of freedom, but a reminder of the vulnerability that comes with it. Edmund Kemper exploited the kindness of strangers, using a friendly wave and a mild-mannered smile to lure his victims to their deaths. He demonstrated that the most terrifying monsters are not always the ones who look the part. Sometimes, they are the ones who look just like everybody else, who know how to say all the right things, and who roam the roads with a patience and a purpose that is too horrific to comprehend until it is far too late. Case 2. The Backpacker Murders Down Under. An investigation into the grim discovery of international travelers' bodies in an Australian state forest. The fear that stalked the redwood-lined roads of Santa Cruz was not unique to America. It is a primal fear, one that transcends borders and cultures, rooted in the vulnerability of the traveler. Across the vast Pacific Ocean lies a continent that has, for generations, been the ultimate destination for the young and the adventurous, Australia. It is a land of stark contrasts and scorched outback, vibrant coastal cities, and dense, ancient forests. For backpackers and hitchhikers from across the globe, it represents a final frontier of freedom, a rite of passage. They arrive with backpacks, guidebooks, and a spirit of boundless optimism, seeking to lose themselves in the sheer scale and beauty of the land. They travel the long, lonely highways that stitch the continent together, their thumbs outstretched, participating in a tradition of trust as old as the roads themselves. But in the late 1980s and early 1990s, for a number of these hopeful travelers, the Australian dream would curdle into an unimaginable nightmare. The open road would lead them not to a new adventure, but into the hands of a predator whose cruelty would etch a permanent scar upon the nation's psyche. Their final destination would be a dark, silent place, a state forest that became a makeshift graveyard. This chapter of roadside horror unfolds in New South Wales, centered around a sprawling, 38-square-kilometer tract of pine plantation and native eucalyptus trees, known as the Belanglo State Forest. Situated about 120 kilometers southwest of Sydney, it is a place easily accessed from the Hume Highway, the main artery connecting Australia's two largest cities. To the passing motorist, Belanglo is little more than a green blur, a place of managed forestry and recreational trails. But deeper within its woods, away from the hum of traffic, the forest holds a different character. It is dense, disorienting, and unnervingly quiet. It is the kind of place where things can be hidden and easily forgotten.
It was the perfect dumping ground.
And for one man, it was the perfect kingdom. The story begins not with a crime, but with a sport. On September 19, 1992, two men engaged in orienteering a cross-country race using a map and compass were navigating a particularly remote section of Belanglo. Pushing through the undergrowth, they stumbled upon a small, unnatural clearing. There, partially concealed by leaf litter and branches, lay the decomposed remains of a human body. The scene was grim and unsettling. The local police from Bowral were called, and a crime scene was established. The initial examination revealed the victim had been stabbed multiple times. A proper identification was impossible due to the advanced state of decomposition. The forest had begun to reclaim its grisly secret. As investigators painstakingly combed the area, they made a second, Even more horrifying discovery just 30 meters away. Another body, in a similar state of decay, hidden in a similarly shallow grave. The two victims were clearly connected. The placement of the bodies, the method of concealment, it was all too deliberate. This was not an isolated murder. It was the work of a single, methodical killer. Forensic analysis and dental records would soon give the victims back their names. They were Joan Walters, 22, and Caroline Clark, 21, two young British backpackers who had been traveling together. They had vanished from the King's Cross area of Sydney, a well-known hub for international travelers, 5 months earlier, in April 1992. The autopsy revealed a sickening level of brutality. Joan had been stabbed 14 times, including 9 times in the back. Caroline had been shot 10 times in the head, and it appeared the killer had used her for target practice. The scene suggested she had been blindfolded and gagged. This was not just murder, it was torture. It was an exercise in absolute power. The discovery sent a shockwave through Australia and across the world. The story of the two murdered British backpackers was international news. Families of other missing travelers contacted Australian authorities, their long-held anxieties now sharpened into acute fear. The New South Wales Police Force assembled a special investigative unit, codenamed Task Force Air, bringing together dozens of detectives to tackle a case that was rapidly expanding in scope and complexity. Their first task was to conduct a massive search of the entire Belanglo State Forest. It was a daunting undertaking. For weeks, hundreds of officers and volunteers walked in grid formations through the dense, unforgiving terrain, their eyes scanning the forest floor for any sign of disturbance, any clue that might lead them to more victims. The forest was silent for over a year. The investigation continued, but with few leads. Task Force Air sifted through missing persons files, creating a list of backpackers who had last been seen hitchhiking south from Sydney along the Hume Highway. A chilling pattern began to emerge. The names were from different countries, their disappearances spread over several years, but the common thread was the road. Then, in October 1993, the forest gave up more of its dead. A man foraging for mushrooms stumbled upon a human skull and bones in another remote section of Belanglo, several kilometers from the first discovery site. Task Force Air descended on the area once more. The remains were identified as those of James Gibson, 19, and his girlfriend, Deborah Everest, also 19. They were an Australian couple from Melbourne who had been missing since December 1989, almost 4 years. They had been heading to a music festival near Albury and were last seen hitchhiking. The forensic evidence told a story of extreme violence. James had suffered multiple stab wounds, including a large one that had severed his upper spinal cord. Deborah's body showed signs of a savage beating. Her skull was fractured in several places, and her jaw was broken. Their bodies had been dumped in different locations, a short distance apart. The killer was evolving, refining his methods of concealment. The discovery of the Australian couple confirmed the investigators' worst fears. The killer had been active for years, long before the murders of Clark and Walters. He was a serial predator who specifically targeted vulnerable young travelers, both local and international. The media dubbed him the backpacker killer. Panic spread among the traveling community. The Hume Highway, once a lifeline for budget-conscious adventurers, was now seen as a corridor of death. Hostels posted warnings, and the sight of a hitchhiker became increasingly rare. For weeks later, in November 1993, the forest yielded its 5th victim. Police search teams, now intimately familiar with the killer's habits, focused on areas near fire trails and clearings. They found the remains of Simone Schmidl, a 21-year-old German backpacker. She had disappeared in January 1991, having been on her way to meet her mother in Melbourne. Her death was, once again, the result of multiple stab wounds, with a similar severing of the spinal cord to that of James Gibson. This detail was a crucial forensic link, a signature. The killer was using a large knife with extreme force, suggesting he was strong and comfortable with this method of killing. A small camp had been made near her body, and spent .22 caliber shell casings were found nearby, another vital link to the murder of Caroline Clark. The pressure on Task Force Air was immense. They were dealing with a ghost who left behind only the brutalized bodies of his victims. The investigation was one of the largest and most complex in Australian history. They analyzed thousands of pieces of information, from vehicle registrations to gun licenses. They began to build a profile of their suspect, likely a male, acting alone, with an intimate knowledge of the Belanglo State Forest. He probably lived or worked in the area, giving him the ability to transport and dispose of his victims without raising suspicion. He was likely a blue-collar worker, strong, and possessed a deep-seated, misogynistic rage. He was organized, taking souvenirs from his victims and using their own camping equipment to create the grim tableaus found at the crime scenes. Just 3 days after finding Simone Schmidl, the search teams made their final, horrific discovery. In a clearing not far away, they found 2 more bodies, buried together in a shallow grave, face to face. They were Gabor Neugebauer, 21, and Anja Habschied, 20, a German couple who had vanished in December 1991. They had also been heading south from Sydney. The scene was one of appalling violence. Anja had been decapitated, and her head was never found. Gabor had been shot 6 times in the head. The killer's methodology was clear. He separated his victims, subdued or killed the male first, and then subjected the female to a prolonged and terrifying ordeal before killing her. It was a pattern of control, domination, and sadistic violence. 7 bodies. 5 crime scenes scattered across the forest. Victims from 3 different countries. The killer had operated with impunity for at least 3 years. Task Force Air now had a wealth of forensic evidence, shell casings, fibers, the distinct signature of the spinal cord wounds, but they still had no suspect. The breakthrough would come not from the forest, but from a memory of a terrified young man who had narrowly escaped with his life. In January 1990, a young British backpacker named Paul Onions had been hitchhiking south from Sydney. He was trying to get to Mildura to find fruit-picking work. On the Hume Highway, near the turnoff to Belanglo, a man in a 4-wheel-drive vehicle pulled over and offered him a ride. The driver introduced himself as Bill. He was a man in his 40s with a thick mustache and a strong, wiry build. At first, the conversation was normal, but as they drove, Bill began asking strange, increasingly personal questions. He seemed obsessed with whether anyone knew where Paul was, or if he was meeting anyone. Paul grew uneasy. The atmosphere in the car turned tense and hostile. Then, as they approached the entrance to the Belanglo State Forest, Bill pulled the car over, claiming he wanted to get some cassette tapes from the back. A moment later, Paul heard a loud metallic click. He turned to see Bill pulling a revolver from under the seat. Bill told him, "This is a robbery." At that moment, a second car, a station wagon with a woman and children inside, pulled up behind them, having stopped for a rest. The sudden appearance of witnesses caused Bill to hesitate for a fraction of a second. It was the only chance Paul would get. He unbuckled his seatbelt, threw open the door, and ran for his life. He sprinted down the highway, not daring to look back as Bill shouted after him. He managed to flag down the passing station wagon, driven by a woman named Joan Barry. He scrambled into her car, babbling about the man with the gun. Barry, seeing his genuine terror, sped away and drove him to the safety of the Bowral police station. Paul Onions gave a detailed statement to the police. He described the man, the car, and the terrifying encounter. At the time, With no other crimes to link it to, the report was filed away as an attempted armed robbery. But now, with the discovery of the bodies, Paul's story took on a new and terrible significance. The location, the description of the man, the targeting of a backpacker, it was too close to be a coincidence. Task Force Air knew this was their key. This was the man who had survived the backpacker killer. The problem was, Paul Onions was back in the United Kingdom. Investigators made an urgent international call. They asked him if he would be willing to return to Australia to help the investigation. He agreed. When he arrived, he worked with detectives, providing every detail he could remember. His statement was the crucial piece of the puzzle that allowed the police to narrow their focus. They had a physical description from a credible witness. The investigation now centered on individuals who matched the profile and the description. One name that kept surfacing was Ivan Milat. He was one of 14 children from a large, notoriously rough immigrant family who lived in the area. Ivan, born in 1944, had a long history of criminal activity, including armed robberies and abductions, though he had often managed to evade conviction. He was a road worker, meaning he spent his days on the highways, including the Hume. He was a gun fanatic and an avid hunter, with an intimate knowledge of the Belanglo State Forest. He matched Paul Onions's description of Bill. The evidence against him began to mount. His work records placed him in the area at the times of the disappearances. He had taken days off work immediately following several of the victims' last known sightings. He had a reputation for violence and a volatile temper, masked by a veneer of knockabout Australian charm. Task Force Air placed him under intense surveillance. The final, undeniable link came from Paul Onions himself. Detectives showed him a photo lineup of several individuals. Without hesitation, he pointed directly to the picture of Ivan Milat. "That's him," he said. "That's the man." With this positive identification, police had enough to act. On the morning of May 22, 1994, over 50 heavily armed police officers stormed Ivan Milat's home in Eagle Vale, a suburb of Sydney. The raid was dramatic and swift. They found Milat and arrested him. But it was the search of his house and the homes of his family members that would seal his fate. Hidden throughout the property in wall cavities, behind a fireplace, in the ceiling was a treasure trove of damning evidence. They found weapons, including parts of a .22 caliber rifle that matched the shell casings found at the crime scenes. But most chillingly, they found the killer's souvenirs. They discovered sleeping bags, backpacks, camping gear, and clothing that belonged to the murdered backpackers. They found the camera of Simone Schmidl and the tent of Gabor Neugebauer and Anya Habschied. The house was a museum of his crimes, a collection of trophies taken from the 7 young people he had murdered and discarded in the forest. Ivan Milat's trial began in March 1996. It was one of the most high-profile trials in Australian history. The prosecution, led by Mark Tedeschi, laid out the overwhelming evidence. The centerpiece of their case was the testimony of Paul Onions, who flew back to Australia once more to face the man who had tried to kill him. In a tense courtroom scene, Onions pointed at Milat and identified him as his attacker. Milat, for his part, was defiant and arrogant throughout the proceedings. He pleaded not guilty, attempting to blame his brothers for the crimes. He showed no remorse, no emotion, other than a sneering contempt for the process. On July 27, 1996, after a 15-week trial, the jury found Ivan Milat guilty on all counts. He was convicted of 7 murders and the abduction of Paul Onions. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. He was sent to Goulburn Supermax, Australia's most secure prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. The case of the backpacker killer left a profound and lasting impact. It shattered Australia's image as a safe haven for travelers and exposed a darkness lurking beneath the surface of the lucky country. The name Belanglo became synonymous with terror, a place forever haunted by the memory of the 7 lives so brutally extinguished there. Questions lingered for years. Did Milat act alone? His attempts to blame his family, combined with the sheer logistics of controlling 2 victims at a time, led many to suspect the involvement of one or more of his brothers, but no one else was ever charged. Ivan Milat never confessed. He maintained his innocence until his death from cancer in prison in 2019, taking any final secrets with him to the grave. He remains one of Australia's most infamous figures, a predator who used the vastness of the Australian landscape as his accomplice. He turned the quintessential Australian experiencia road trip through the bush into a deadly trap. He preyed on the trust and optimism of young adventurers, and in doing so, he reminded the world that even in the most beautiful and welcoming of places, the horror of the open road can be waiting just around the next bend. Case 3. The Phantom of Highway 101, the chilling, unsolved mystery of a serial killer who preyed on young women in Sonoma County. There is a particular kind of dread reserved for a story without an ending. When a killer is caught, like Edmund Kemper or Ivan Milat, there is a grim finality. The monster is given a name and a face, his motivations are dissected, and society, however scarred, can close the book. Justice, in its stark and imperfect way, is served. But when a killer is not caught, the story remains unfinished. The fear he created does not dissipate. It lingers, becoming a ghost that haunts a generation. The case file grows cold, the leads turn to dust, but the questions remain, echoing in the quiet corridors of police stations and in the hearts of the families left behind. There is no closure, only a chilling ellipsis, a void where a final chapter should be. This is the story of such a phantom, a predator who emerged from the fog of Northern California, committed a series of unspeakable acts, and then vanished as completely as if he had never been. He is known only by the geography of his crimes, the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer. Our story returns to California, but we move north from the haunted redwood groves of Santa Cruz to the rolling hills and burgeoning vineyards of Sonoma County. In the early 1970s, this region, anchored by the city of Santa Rosa, was a pastoral landscape undergoing a slow transformation. It was a place of apple orchards, dairy farms, and small, tight-knit communities. The iconic Highway 101 served as its spine, a concrete river carrying locals to work and school, and a steady stream of travelers drawn to the promise of the Pacific Northwest. Here, too, hitchhiking was a common practice, an unquestioned part of the local culture, especially for the young. It was a landscape that felt safe, knowable, and insulated from the kind of predatory violence that seemed to belong to the sprawling metropolises to the south. But between 1972 and 1973, this sense of security would be systematically dismantled, one victim at a time, by a killer who operated with terrifying efficiency and left almost no trace of his existence. The nightmare began on a cold winter day. On February 4th, 1972, the body of a young woman was found by a passerby, submerged in a shallow creek off Franz Valley Road, a rural stretch of pavement northeast of Santa Rosa. The scene was disturbingly serene and meticulously arranged. The victim was naked, and her hands were bound behind her back with twine from a clothesline. An intricate macrame belt, one she had likely made herself, was used to bind her ankles. There was evidence of sexual assault. She had been strangled. Her name was Kim Wendy Allen. She was 19 years old, an art student at Santa Rosa Junior College. She had last been seen 4 days earlier, hitchhiking from her job at a health food store. Kim was described as bright, creative, and gentle. The care with which her body was bound and placed suggested a killer who was not frenzied, but cold, methodical, and patient. He had taken his time. He was enjoying his work. The discovery of Kim Allen's body was shocking, but it was initially viewed as a tragic, isolated incident. There was no reason to suspect it was the opening act of a serial killer's reign. For the next 3 months, an uneasy peace settled back over Sonoma County. Then, on March 4th, the body of another young woman was found. Jeanette Kamahele, a 20-year-old student, had vanished a week earlier after her car broke down on Highway 101. She was last seen talking to a man in a brown Chevrolet sedan. Her body, found in a ditch miles away, was in an advanced state of decomposition, making a cause of death difficult to determine, but the circumstances were deeply suspicious. While not officially linked by the same signature as the others, her case hovered over the subsequent investigation like a specter. The true nature of the threat became undeniable 2 months later. On May 29th, the body of 13-year-old Yvonne Weber was discovered in a gravel pit off a lonely road. She had been missing for 10 days. Yvonne was a child, a student at Cook Middle School. She had been dropped off by her mother near her home and was expected to walk or hitch a short ride the rest of the way. She never made it. Her body was decomposed, but evidence pointed to strangulation. The murder of a 13-year-old girl sent a jolt of pure terror through the community. This was no longer about college students making risky choices. This was about children being snatched from their own neighborhoods in broad daylight. The summer of 1972 passed with no new victims, but the fear was palpable. The Sonoma County Sheriff's Office was struggling. They had no witnesses, no physical evidence of value, and no suspects. The killer was a ghost. He left his victims, but he took his identity with him. As fall arrived, the phantom returned. On a foggy November day, 2 young boys playing in the woods discovered a human skull. It belonged to Lori Lee Corsa, another 13-year-old girl. She had disappeared in November 1972, telling her mother she was going to a nearby store. She was last seen hitchhiking. Her skeletal remains were scattered, picked apart by animals, but the cause of death was determined to be a broken neck. The proximity of her disappearance to Yvonne Weber's murder was terrifying. The killer was hunting children. The historical context of this period is critical to understanding the chaos and confusion that gripped both the public and law enforcement. At the exact same time that the Santa Rosa killer was active, Edmund Kemper was committing his co-ed murders just 150 miles to the south in Santa Cruz. The methods were different. Kemper used a gun and dismembered his victims, but the target demographic, young female hitchhikers, was identical. Furthermore, in the broader Pacific Northwest, another, even more prolific monster was in the early stages of his own horrific career: Ted Bundy. Law enforcement agencies, with limited communication and forensic technology compared to today, were overwhelmed. Were they dealing with one killer covering a vast territory? Or were multiple predators operating independently at the same time? The latter possibility was almost too frightening to contemplate. As 1972 drew to a close, the fear in Sonoma County was a tangible thing. The friendly wave to a passing hitchhiker was replaced with a locked door and a suspicious glare. The local newspaper, the Press-Democrat, ran articles pleading with young women not to hitchhike, but the habit, born of convenience and a now-shattered sense of communal trust, was hard to break. The killer seemed to take a brief hiatus before returning with a vengeance. On December 28, 1972, 2 friends, Maureen Sterling and Dolores D. Cepeda, both just 12 years old, vanished from a skating rink in Santa Rosa. They were inseparable, 2 typical preteens looking forward to the holidays. They were last seen hitchhiking, hoping for a short ride home. For 2 weeks, Their families and the community held onto a desperate hope. That hope was extinguished when their skeletal remains were found down a steep embankment off a rural road. The evidence was scant due to exposure, but the implication was clear. They had been taken together and murdered together. The abduction of two children at once suggested a killer who was confident, brazen, and utterly without empathy. The community was now living in a state of siege. The new year, 1973, brought no relief. In February, a motorcyclist riding along a rural road near the town of Calistoga noticed some clothing caught in a barbed wire fence. Investigating further, he found the decomposing body of a young woman in the ravine below. She was identified as 15-year-old Carolyn Davis. She had been a resident of a group home in a nearby town and had been reported missing 6 weeks earlier. She was a vulnerable runaway, the perfect, invisible victim for a predator looking to operate without immediate alarm. The final confirmed victim of the series was found a week after Carolyn Davis. On February 19, 1973, the naked body of 23-year-old Teresa Walsh was discovered floating in Mark West Creek. She had been seen a week earlier at a beach, hitchhiking, wearing only a bikini. She had been strangled. The location, Mark West Creek, was chillingly close to where Kim Wendy Allen had been found almost exactly a year earlier. It was as if the killer was returning to his preferred hunting grounds, operating on a dark, internal schedule. And then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. After the discovery of Teresa Walsh's body, the series of murders ceased. There were no more young women found in creeks or ravines. The phantom of Highway 101 had retreated back into the fog. The investigation, however, was far from over. Task forces were formed, linking the Sonoma County Sheriff's Office with neighboring agencies. They looked at every known sex offender in Northern California. They examined the files of thousands of individuals. When Edmund Kemper was arrested in April 1973 and confessed to his 8 murders, there was a brief hope that he might be the Santa Rosa killer as well. He was interviewed extensively about the Sonoma County cases, but his confession was specific and verifiable. He accounted for his time, and his methods were different. He adamantly denied any involvement in the Northern murders. Investigators believed him. Their ghost was still out there. Another, more infamous name would later be attached to the case: Ted Bundy. Bundy lived in Washington state during this period, but was known to travel extensively. His victim profile and modus operandi targeting young women, feigning injury to gain their trust, sexual assault, and murder bore some similarities. Bundy was a suspect in dozens of unsolved murders up and down the West Coast. He was questioned about the Santa Rosa killings, but, like Kemper, denied involvement. While some circumstantial evidence and timeline possibilities existed, nothing concrete ever tied him to the Sonoma County crimes. He was a convenient suspect, a headline-grabbing name to attach to an unsolvable mystery, but most investigators believe the Santa Rosa killer was a local man. The most compelling suspect to emerge over the years was a man named Arthur Lee Allen, who was also the prime suspect in the Zodiac killer case that had terrorized the San Francisco Bay Area just a few years prior. Allen lived in the area, owned the same caliber weapons used in some Zodiac attacks, and matched a physical description. A friend of Allen's reported to police that Allen had confessed to a desire to hunt humans and had spoken of killing hitchhikers. A search of his trailer revealed hunting knives and evidence of a macabre fascination with violence. Crucially, one of the victims, Jeanette Kamahele, was last seen near Allen's workplace. He was interviewed multiple times and kept under surveillance, but police could never gather enough evidence to charge him. DNA tests conducted years after his death in 1992 were inconclusive or did not match the partial profiles recovered from the Zodiac letters. His connection to the Santa Rosa murders remains a tantalizing but unproven theory. As the years turned into decades, the case went cold. The files, filled with faded photographs and brittle reports, were passed down from one generation of detectives to the next. The Santa Rosa hitchhiker murders became a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered to children. For the families of Kim Allen, Yvonne Weber, Lori Lee Corsa, Maureen Sterling, Dolores Cepeda, Carolyn Davis, and Teresa Walsh, there was no resolution. They were left to live in the shadow of an unanswered question, a grief compounded by the knowledge that the man who stole their daughters, their sisters, their friends, had gotten away with it. In 2011, a flicker of hope emerged. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to develop a partial profile from evidence collected at one of the crime scenes. They began testing it against known suspects, including Arthur Lee Allen. The results were negative. The phantom was not Allen. He was someone else entirely. To this day, the case remains officially open but inactive. The identity of the killer is a secret the Earth has kept for half a century. The story of the Santa Rosa hitchhiker killer is a chilling study in anonymity. The killer was a shadow who moved through a community gripped by fear, a fear he himself was creating. He may have been a neighbor, a coworker, a husband, a father. He may have read the newspaper articles about his own crimes, perhaps even attended a community meeting about the murders. He could have driven past the makeshift memorials on the roadside and felt a secret, godlike thrill. Or perhaps he simply moved away. Or died of old age, taking his monstrous identity to the grave, his neighbors remembering him as nothing more than a quiet man who kept to himself. This is the enduring horror of the Phantom of Highway 101. He is not a monster in a cell or a name in a history book. He is a question mark. A ghost who roamed the roads, collected his victims, and then simply disappeared, leaving behind only the cold, silent proof of his passage and a legacy of fear that has never truly faded. Case 4. The Girl in the Box, a hitchhiker's horrifying 7-year ordeal of captivity and the complex psychology of her captors. The stories we have explored thus far have ended in the silence of the grave. They are chronicles of lives cut short, of a trust that was met with fatal, final violence. But there is another kind of horror, one that does not end in a single, brutal moment. It is a horror that is drawn out, day by day, year by year, in a prolonged state of living death. It is a story not of a life taken, but of a life stolen, where the victim is forced to exist in a twilight world of absolute submission, their very identity systematically erased and rebuilt by their captor. This is a journey into a darkness so profound that the lines between victim and accomplice, reality and fiction, become terrifyingly blurred. It is a story that begins, like the others, with an outstretched thumb on the side of a road, but it descends into a uniquely psychological abyss, a 7-year nightmare orchestrated by a seemingly ordinary couple in a quiet Northern California town. This is the story of Colleen Stan, who would come to be known as the Girl in the Box. On May 19, 1977, Colleen Stan, a bright and adventurous 20-year-old, stood by a roadside in Northern California, hoping to hitch a ride. She was on her way from her home in Eugene, Oregon, to a friend's birthday party in Westwood, California. She was an experienced hitchhiker, confident in her ability to judge character and stay safe. She had already turned down 2 rides that didn't feel right. The third vehicle that pulled over seemed perfect. It was a blue Dodge Colt, and inside was a young couple with a baby. The driver was a lanky young man with a mustache, and the woman beside him was his wife. The presence of the baby was disarming, a powerful symbol of safety and normalcy. To Colleen, they looked like a harmless young family. She accepted the ride. The man was Cameron Hooker, 23 years old. His wife was Janice, 19. They were, on the surface, an unremarkable couple. Cameron worked as a lumber mill worker in the town of Red Bluff, California. They had been married for a few years. But beneath this placid exterior, Cameron Hooker harbored a set of dark, meticulously detailed fantasies. He was obsessed with the idea of capturing and owning a slave, a woman he could subject to his every whim, breaking her spirit until she was a mere extension of his will. He had been planning this for years, building the tools for his fantasy long before he found his victim. Janice, a quiet and submissive young woman who was herself a victim of Cameron's control and abuse, was a reluctant but terrified accomplice in his plan. She had been conditioned to believe that her survival depended on her obedience. For the first hour of the drive, everything was normal. They made small talk. Colleen played with the baby. But as they traveled down a lonely, isolated stretch of road, the atmosphere in the car shifted. Cameron pulled off the main highway onto a deserted dirt track, claiming he wanted to show Colleen an interesting natural feature. The moment the car stopped, the facade of normalcy shattered. Cameron turned to Colleen, a knife in his hand, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. He told her to be quiet and do exactly as he said. What happened next was swift and terrifyingly practiced. He forced her from the car and made her put her head into a bizarre, custom-built contraption. It was a wooden box, hinged and lined with foam, designed to fit over a person's head, silencing them and plunging them into total darkness. It was a sensory deprivation device, the first tool in his psychological arsenal. With the head box locked over her head, Colleen was helpless, disoriented, and completely at his mercy. He placed her back in the car and drove her to his and Janice's mobile home in Red Bluff. This was to be her world for the next 7 years. For the first several months, Colleen's existence was one of almost constant confinement. Cameron had built another, larger box. It was roughly the size of a coffin, constructed of wood, and kept under the marital bed. He would force Colleen into this box for up to 23 hours a day. In the suffocating darkness, she was deprived of light, sound, and human contact, except for the moments when Cameron would take her out to subject her to brutal physical and sexual assaults. This was the first stage of his plan, to break her through sheer physical and sensory deprivation. He wanted to strip away her sense of self, to reduce her to a state of primal fear and dependence. But Cameron Hooker's ultimate goal was not just physical control, it was complete psychological domination. He knew that physical restraints alone were not enough. A prisoner will always look for a chance to escape. So, he began to construct a new, invisible prison around Colleen, a prison built of lies and fear. He introduced her to a powerful and sinister fiction he had created, a mysterious and all-powerful organization known only as the Company. He told her that he was not acting alone. He was a small part of the secret, international network that dealt in the trafficking of slaves. He claimed the Company had eyes and ears everywhere. They had a detailed file on her and her family. He showed her what appeared to be official-looking documents forged of Curcido prove their existence. He explained that her life was now governed by a slavery contract. If she ever tried to escape, or if she failed to obey any command, the Company would not just hunt her down and torture her to death. They would do the same to her entire family, her parents, her sisters. This was his masterstroke. By threatening her loved ones, he shackled her more securely than any chains ever could. The fear for her family became her prison warden. To reinforce this fiction, Cameron and Janice would stage conversations in front of Colleen, talking about other members of the Company, their activities, and the brutal punishments meted out to those who disobeyed. They made her believe that she was under constant surveillance, that even if she were to walk out the front door, she would be caught within minutes. He convinced her that her only path to survival, and the only way to protect her family was through total, unquestioning obedience. As his control solidified, Cameron began to allow Colleen out of the box for longer periods. He gave her a new name, Kay, to further strip her of her old identity. He forced her to perform chores around the house, to cook and clean. To the outside world, if anyone were to see her, she might appear to be a live-in nanny. He even began taking her outside. She would go jogging with him, work in the yard. This is the most bewildering aspect of Colleen's captivity. She was presented with numerous opportunities to flee, yet she never did. She was physically free, but psychologically, she was still locked in the box. The fear of the company was so deeply ingrained in her mind that she believed escape was impossible and its consequences catastrophic. The psychological complexity of the situation was deepened by the role of Janice Hooker. Janice was not a simple, monstrous accomplice. She was also a captive, trapped in a web of Cameron's abuse and control long before Colleen arrived. Cameron was physically and emotionally abusive towards Janice, and she lived in constant fear of him. At times, she was forced to participate in Colleen's abuse. At other times, she exhibited jealousy and resentment towards Colleen, who was now the primary focus of Cameron's obsessive attention. Yet, there were also moments of shared victimhood, a silent understanding between the two women who were both prisoners of the same man. This triad of captor, slave, and abused accomplice created a toxic, distorted domestic world, isolated from all reality. In 1981, for years into her captivity, Cameron's confidence in his control over Colleen was so absolute that he took an incredible risk. He allowed Colleen to visit her family. He drove her to her parents' home and waited in the car while she went inside. Her family was overjoyed to see her. They had reported her missing years ago and had feared the worst. But the woman who walked through their door was not the same Colleen who had left. She seemed distant, robotic. She introduced her boyfriend Cameron, who she said had been protecting her. She explained that she had joined a strange, cult-like group and could not leave. Her family was confused and disturbed, but they did not understand the true nature of her situation. She was with them, in the safety of her childhood home, surrounded by people who loved her. But in her mind, the invisible agents of the company were watching from across the street. The threat was as real to her as the walls of the room. After a short, stilted visit, she walked back out the door and got into Cameron's car. She returned to her prison. For 3 more years, this bizarre and horrifying existence continued. Colleen lived as the family's slave and nanny, caring for the hooker's 2 children, sleeping in her box at night, her mind still held captive by the fiction of the company. But the foundation of Cameron's control, his wife Janice, was beginning to crack. The years of abuse, coupled with a burgeoning sense of guilt over what was being done to Colleen, began to take their toll. She found a measure of solace in religion and started attending church. A pastor she confided in encouraged her to see that what was happening was wrong. The final catalyst came when she began to fear that Cameron would eventually subject their own daughters to the same fate as Colleen. In August 1984, Janice's resolve finally broke. She went to Colleen in private and told her the truth. "The company isn't real," she said. "He made it all up." For Colleen, this revelation was like a switch being thrown in her mind. The psychological prison that had held her for 7 years began to crumble. Janice told her she needed to leave, that Cameron would never let her go willingly, and that she would help her escape. A few days later, Colleen Stan, with Janice's help, walked away from the Hooker home and boarded a bus. She was free, but her ordeal was far from over. She was deeply traumatized, struggling to reconnect with reality and her own identity. When she finally went to the police, her story was so bizarre, so beyond the realm of normal experience that some officers were initially skeptical. Why didn't she run? Why did she go back after visiting her family? It was Janice Hooker's testimony that would be the key. Seeking to save herself and her children, she went to the police and confessed everything. In exchange for full immunity from prosecution, she agreed to testify against her husband. Cameron Hooker was arrested in November 1984. He denied everything. His trial was a legal and psychological spectacle. The prosecutor, Christine McGuire, faced the immense challenge of explaining to a jury how a person could be held captive without physical restraints. The centerpiece of the evidence was Janice's chilling, detailed testimony, which laid bare the years of abuse, control, and manipulation. The other key piece of evidence was the box itself. It was brought into the courtroom, a silent, terrifying testament to Colleen's ordeal. When the jury saw the cramped, coffin-like container, the abstract horror of the story became sickeningly real. Cameron Hooker was found guilty of kidnapping, rape, and other charges. He was sentenced to 104 years in prison. His carefully constructed world of fantasy and control had been dismantled. The story of Colleen Stan is a profound and disturbing testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the terrifying power of psychological manipulation. It demonstrates that the most secure prisons are not built of steel and concrete, but of fear and lies. Cameron Hooker did not just imprison Colleen's body. He hijacked her mind, turning her own love for her family into the bars of her cage. Her 7-year ordeal on the side of a quiet road in Red Bluff stands as one of the most extreme and bizarre cases of captivity in modern criminal history. Her survival and eventual reclaiming of her own life is a story of incredible strength, a quiet refutation of the monster who believed he could own another human soul. The open road will always be a symbol of the unknown. For every traveler who finds adventure, for every soul who finds freedom, there is a shadow of risk. The stories we've shared from the folio of Edmund Kemper's Masked Rage, Ivan Milat's Predatory Kingdom, The Nameless Phantom of Highway 101, and Cameron Hooker's Psychological Labyrinth are not meant simply to frighten. They are cautionary tales, etched into the asphalt of our collective memory. They remind us of the fragility of trust and the terrifying truth that the greatest dangers often wear the most ordinary faces. They are a testament to the lives that were lost and to the strength of those who survived. They compel us to look a little closer, to listen a little harder, and to remember that the price of passage is vigilance. Thank you for joining us at the Crime Folio. We hope the stories shared tonight serve not as a source of fear, but as a reminder to be safe on your own journeys. Good night and sleep well.